Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the latest Downtown Den event. I'm delighted to be joined by the Chief Executive of the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, Eamonn Boylan. Eamonn and I last spoke probably about 6 or 7 months ago when we promised the next time we'd see each other would be face to face. I think we were being somewhat optimistic and perhaps misread the seriousness of the pandemic and the absolute chaos it was going to cause. But listen, we are where we are. And Eamonn, first of all, great to see you. Thanks for being with us again today.
Thanks, Frank. Happy to join you.
And we now at least have a route map out of the lockdown. Greater Manchester, of course, its business community have faced huge challenges during the past 9-10 months. First of all, let me get your views on that roadmap. Do you think the government are taking the right approach now?
I think generally, yes, they are. One of the problems that we felt we faced last year was that we didn't have a consistent national approach, and we were taken in and out of lockdowns too quickly. Certainly brought out of lockdown too quickly. And I think the more structured and considered approach that the Prime Minister set out in his statement earlier this week is the right approach. We can argue about the detail, and certainly, getting all students back into school in one shot on one day is quite a big risk, and we'll have to see how that lands. But overall, we think the approach is right. Now, I understand the frustration of many business owners who are still seeing a lengthy flight path towards reopening. But I do think if the Prime Minister is right, and I believe his objectives are right in saying that he wants this to be irreversible, then that's in all of our best interests. I think the key thing will be what the Chancellor has to say next week about the continuing support for individual livelihoods and businesses moving forward, because that's going to be critical to the ability of a number of businesses to survive, obviously, between now and June, when hopefully, touch wood, we will see the full unlocking of all of our sectors.
And if you look at the economic impact over the past 9-10 months, Eamonn, clearly the hospitality sector has been hugely damaged during that period, and we've got a big visitor economy right across Greater Manchester. But equally, the ecosystem that supports that sector has also been hit, and perhaps not as well supported as the hospitality sector. Not that the hospitality sector has been massively well supported, I have to say.
Yeah.
But what are you thinking in terms of how we can begin to start to rebuild what was, let's face it, pre-pandemic, a really thriving economy in this part of the world?
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly, and you're right to say that the impacts go beyond those supported sectors. I mean, when you think about the impact on the supply chain for hospitality, you think about the impact on those people running independent businesses without rateable values and the way they've struggled to get support, the self-employed and the difficulties they've had. I mean, it has been huge. And it's not just hospitality. I mean, other sectors that are critical to Greater Manchester's economy, aviation being an obvious one, is absolutely crippled. And so there's an awful lot of rebuilding to do. I think one thing that we are very much signed up to, though, is to try and understand how we build back, but not just build back on the assumption that everything will return to what it was before, but how we actually understand how we need to evolve rapidly our approach and our overall economic framework for Greater Manchester, because it will not be the same. And also the reality is, if I'm honest, Frank, while the pandemic has not in itself created any inequalities, the spotlight that it shone on the vulnerability of large parts of our community because of their dependence on casual and very unsecure employment as being massive. And I think we need to, if we're going to be genuine about levelling up both within our great cities as well as between the south and the north, we've got to tackle that head on. And that's as big a challenge almost as building back the infrastructure. But we're trying to plan on the basis that there will be a gradual return to normality. No one's expecting everyone to be rushing back into their offices as of next month. That's just not going to happen. So we are trying to anticipate what it is that we need in terms of enabling infrastructure to try and make certain that people can make choices and support businesses in making those choices. But we are obviously very, very keen to get life and activity back into our city and town centres in particular, try and make sure that the sectors that depend on those locations can start to thrive.
And of course, as we start to consider how we get back into offices, how we can start to revive city and town centres, certain initiatives are being discussed at government level. I'm sure those conversations are being had with yourselves as well, around things such as COVID passports and a much better test and trace system than being the case in the past. Any progress being made as far as those discussions are concerned, Eamonn?
Well, obviously, COVID passports is very much an issue of the day. The Prime Minister's announced that he is launching a review. I think it's fair to say the government's instinctive reaction is to resist, though in terms of their the ethical and civil liberties implications. I think from an economic recovery perspective, I've got a fairly blunt view. I think if people want to exercise a choice to not take a vaccine, that's their choice, but there may be consequences as a result of that. Do I want to have people working in care homes long term if they're promoting a real risk to the occupants of those care homes because they won't have a vaccination? I do think we need to take on some of those challenges, and they are real challenges as we speak. On test and trace, I mean, I think, again, I don't want to sound overly critical, but that has been one of the big failures of the whole pandemic. And one of the things which we've been calling for loud and long, and I know many other cities have been saying the same thing, is that a locally controlled, locally directed test and trace and isolate strategy. Because there's a really big issue about people's inability or reluctance to isolate, which we just need to recognise as being a real factor. Has worked much better. We're achieving much better rates of contact with tracing contacts rather, running that locally than trying to run it nationally. And if we'd moved more quickly towards that, then I think we'd be in a better place. But the other thing to say is when you've got rampant levels of infection, test and trace starts to become a little bit like a bit of noise in the machine. As we come out of that, and we therefore need to really nail down where those pockets of infection still are, test and trace is going to be absolutely fundamental. It's going to be as important as vaccination, in my view, as we move forward. So we're hopeful that we'll have a better approach, and a better approach is emerging around test and trace. And obviously the vaccination rollout, again, we can all argue about how we might be able to do it quicker and better. The reality is that some of the national vaccination centres like the Etihad are significantly underutilised as a result of the national booking system. But the reality is, we are doing better than anywhere else in the world bar Israel in terms of vaccination, and that's something that we really ought to give the government credit for, in fairness. So that gives us ground for optimism. But unless we get the test and trace machinery properly engineered and properly driven locally, then we will still put populations at risk.
And then, as you say, we need to start thinking about how we support those who need to isolate as well. But that's another issue, I guess. But does need to
it is, and the fact that notionally you can get 500 quid if you have to isolate for two weeks, but then discover that you're one of the 8.5 in 10 who can't access it. It's a bit of a bugger. But then there's also the reality of people in insecure work. It's not the 2 weeks isolation that they're worried about. It's the fact that they'll just won't have a job to go back to.
Oh, correct.
And that's something that we need to work with employers on, as well as people who have to self-isolate. But we need to do more to make it possible for people to make that choice, because the difficulties around self-isolation are amplified in our communities of deprivation. And that's the same here in Liverpool, in Leeds, in Newcastle, wherever you go. It's the same problem, and that's something we've got to address.
And I can sense some frustration, and I know there has been frustration from combined authorities, not just in Greater Manchester, perhaps a lack of partnership working with some of the things that have been done during this pandemic. The thing that I thought was absolutely crazy just prior to Christmas was the reintroduction of tiered systems. You know, the idea that you can put Liverpool into tier 2, Manchester into tier 3, or whatever we ended up with. I can't even remember what the numbers were in the end. Cheshire, I think, is as well. And of course, the inevitable happened. You know, people just basically left the geographical area where the restrictions were tighter and moved to places where they were more relaxed. And the other thing is, Eamonn, the point that you make there about the Etihad being underused. No, we have a national health service, but again, I think what Greater Manchester has absolutely evidenced over the past 4 years is where you've got devolved health and social care, you can actually deliver a far more efficient and effective way of providing services. So again, any progress being made with the Whitehall decision makers on these things?
Well, I mean, I totally agree with you about the tiering system and the way that worked, and the notion that Liverpool was rewarded for being good by being put into tier 2. I mean, that was a real gift that carried on giving, wasn't it? But I don't get this tourism bit. I don't think it was Manx travelling to Liverpool. It's just you Scousers going bonkers that was the problem. But I do agree with you. I mean, if you talk to Sir Richard Leese, one of the things that he said very, very early on in the devolution discussions when we were talking to, I think before the David Cameron government, and the point that he made was, if you want to guarantee postcode lottery, do the same thing from a national level to every place, and you'll get different outcomes in every place because every place is different. And he's absolutely right. And so the journey that we've been on in terms of devolved health and social care in GM, I mean, it's still very much an unfinished business, and we still have significantly worse health outcomes than we aspire to. But the reality is we are making a real difference. And we're making that difference through an effective integration between health, primary health, secondary health, tertiary health, and social care in a way that I think is probably not replicated anywhere else in the country. And that's not criticising other people. And a lot of my opposite numbers and other combined authorities still think I'm utterly bonkers to take on health and social care because it's really, really hard. And I can assure you it bloody well is. But it is a necessary thing. And in fairness, what the government is now recognising, what the Department of Health is now recognising, through the consultation that they're undertaking around integrated care systems, is actually this is the right way to go. Now, whether the ICS model that the NHS is promoting is, exactly bang on, we can argue about that till the cows come home. But fundamentally, it recognises the need for an effective, locally based, place-based integrated system, and that I think is a huge step forward. And that's what we've been trying to push forward, and that's what we've been arguing for and trying to build here for ages. And during the pandemic, it's had some really positive impacts. We now got GPs working better with care homes, stopping care homes taking people into A&E. We've got a better discharge system working now with community-based care, enabling people to leave hospital more quickly. We've got a single patient record that we've developed here in GM, so every single health professional can see your details in one go. So you don't have to do what you've always done whenever you've gone to a doctor and tell your story again and again and again and again, depending on which specialist you then get passed on to. So there have been some real progress and things that we want to hang on to that have been accelerated, if you like, by the pandemic. So it's good, and I'm encouraged that, as I said, the thinking about integration and local integration as an essential driver of health and care outcomes is a better way for us to think. And at its crudest level, our argument has always been we should have a health and well-being system, not a system that's designed to intervene with expertise at the point at which your health has failed. And that's the traditional model that's developed around the NHS. That's not a criticism. It's just a fact, and I think most people in the NHS recognise that. So it's encouraging that we're seeing government starting to move in a direction that we've been arguing for a number of years.
And there are going to be some huge challenges moving forward, because we know that the other consequences of lockdowns and the period that we've gone through are going to be impacted on things like mental health and many other things as well.
Yeah, I mean, and that's been. I think we've had a bit of a false dichotomy that's, if I'm honest, has held us back a bit, where it's almost been seen as a binary choice. You deal with COVID, i.e. lockdown, or you deal with the economy and the wider health issues. And somehow, actually, you've got to do them both. And so I think, where we are now is a much better place than we were towards, the end of the summer, early autumn last year, where I don't think we were seeing that broader picture. Now, I'm sure many people on the call will say, well, we're not really seeing enough of the economic picture yet. But I think we're in a better place to address that. But you're quite right. It impacts on mental health, impacts on cancer, impacts on all forms of routine care and treatment have been profound. And in some places, in some ways, those gaps have been made up. And I think the NHS has done a heroic job in keeping mainstream services running while managing through the COVID crisis. And reality is they have done much better this time round than in the first wave, where I think everyone was completely unprepared. But those impacts are going to be very, very real, and they will be with us for a long, long time to come. How long is it going to take kids from deprived backgrounds to recover their educational attainment that they could and should have achieved, and they're now a mile off? And that could be a life-changing thing for those young people.
So, Eamonn, listen, let's turn into the future in terms of the economy. And again, I know that the Combined Authority here have been working really hard in terms of recovery plans and trying to identify where the potential and opportunity lies in the future. Again, recovery plans being produced. Tell us a little bit more about that, and tell us what you're thinking behind that plan and strategy is.
Well, we've already said, there is a real need for us to have an absolute focus on the place context for business. And that's fundamentally around town and city centres, where we've got to redouble our efforts to try and make certain that we understand and anticipate how the changes in demand, the changes in occupancy will reflect what opportunities they create, as well as what challenges they bring. And quite clearly, looking at the high street right now, it feels a very, very challenging place to be. So what can we do working in partnership with business to try and diversify uses? We've been talking about that for years. When I was talking about that when I was in Stockport, about the need to diversify uses in the town centre, and we started to make some progress there, but in an awful lot of places, we're just not where we need to be, and we recognise that. But I think there's also a need for us to recognise that COVID has changed a great deal, but some of the fundamentals haven't changed. So some of the areas where we believe that there are real strengths in GM that can help drive both economic growth locally and the competitiveness of Manchester and the UK on a global scale remain the same. They are still about advanced materials. They are still around health innovation. They are still about tech and digital. They are still about creative industries. And those are areas where we agreed a strategy with government maybe 2 years, a year and a half ago. And then with the change of government, the term local industrial strategy fell out of favour, and we weren't allowed to talk about it anymore. But so we can call it what we like, but the reality is the fundamental sectoral priorities that sit within those remain strengths that we need to capitalise on. And so developments like Innovation Greater Manchester, which is being led by Chris Oglesby from Bruntwood, working alongside the LEP, working alongside our universities, are really the heart and the centre of how we think we can revive and revitalise our economy moving forward. But the other side of that, that we really are frustrated about and will continue to push very hard on, is the need to ensure that as we rebuild the economy, it goes back to the point I made earlier on, we're building it in a way that can enable more of our people to access and benefit from it in a meaningful way. And at the heart of that little bit of rhetoric is how on earth do we take a skills system that currently focuses on a series of narrowly drawn priorities, like making people resit maths and English when they failed them twice, rather than actually equipping them with a useful skill that could get them a foothold in the digital industries, because they can be competent coders and such like, is an immense frustration to us. And so we are continuing to push, and I think starting to get a little bit more traction now on not how we have an argument with government over the devolution of skills, but how we have a conversation with government about how we co-design skills programs so they actually more effectively mesh with the demands that are emerging in the local economy. And that, I think, is really, really important to us. Make certain, A, that people can access opportunity, but also that employers making investment decisions can have confidence they can access the supply chain of skills that they need to be able to drive their businesses forward, or at least have people coming in with a level of competence that can enable them then to train those people in a way that suits that business. So those are just some of the thoughts that we've got at the moment.
I think if we've learned anything over the past 9 months, it's that actually we do need to radically change the way we look at education training. I mean, we talked about the impact on young people, particularly kids still of school age, but you'll be aware, Eamonn, there's many, many people now in the 40s and 50s who have lost their job. They've been in sectors that unfortunately have just not been able to survive the pandemic. And so, you know, we flippantly talk about lifelong learning as though this is something naturally people fall into. We're now talking about a group of the population who probably haven't been near a classroom or near any sort of formal training for 20, 30 years. We've got to start to deliver some bespoke packages, I think, for that part of the community. Otherwise, you know, you and I can remember the 80s and some of the awful things that happened to individuals then. And I do fear that we're going to leave behind, you know, so many people if we're not a bit more nimble and flexible in our approach.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, pre-pandemic, the largest group of people distant from the labour market in Greater Manchester were people over 50. It wasn't young unemployed people. Sadly, because of the pandemic, I think the number of young unemployed is now catching up, to be perfectly honest. But that group remains a key priority for us. And if you look at the Greater Manchester strategy, and you know, I'd always recommend one of our strategies as bedtime reading. If all else fails, you'll be asleep within 30 seconds. But it's always been about start well, live well, and age well. And that's not about an aging strategy built around care and health. It is about a strategy built around engagement, and that includes active economic engagement as well. And so our ability as a nation to fund effectively adult skills to that population is very limited, actually. And that's what I say. One of the things that we are talking to government about is how can we co-design framework. It's not just about young people. It is also about reskilling people and enabling them to then compete in emerging markets. Because an awful lot of those people who, as you say, the sector that they worked in has gone. And you might look at things like, for example, as a modern equivalent, high street retail, and the impact if it's not gone, but it's suffered an almighty blow, and a lot of people have fallen out of employment in places like Debenhams and others. But they've got skills around customer care, around stock management, around all sorts of things that are going to be useful and applicable in other industries. How do we give them a platform to be able to then apply those skills as other sectors emerge? And I think that's a really, really big problem for us that we still, as a nation, aren't in the right place on. But I think locally, which we're hoping to try and push a little bit further, a little bit faster, to support that incredibly important group. Speaking as an over 50 myself.
Yeah. And Eamonn, if we talk about Greater Manchester's recovery again, what you've always been very conscious of is where Greater Manchester fits into this wider piece that we now describe as the Northern Powerhouse, and how important it is that we do have that cohesion, coordination, and improvements to infrastructure across the north that will benefit everybody. And so, again, listen, I think almost inevitably during the pandemic, nobody's been banging the drum too hard in terms of Northern Powerhouse, but we did have a commitment from the government about levelling up. We do have an elected mayor on the way and a combined authority for West Yorkshire. And so there has been some movement and progress made as far as that agenda is concerned. How important do you think it is now for the North to continue that greater coordination Or do you think that perhaps because of what's happened over the last 9, 10 months, we may see a period where people become a little more parochial and the government actually show a little less interest in that Northern Powerhouse project?
Well, the government has announced its commitment both to Northern Powerhouse and to the levelling up agenda. I think, we need to be clear, though, that one person's levelling up agenda is not necessarily what yours and mine might be. And we just need to recognise the reality of that. If you look at the criteria that will apply to the levelling up fund that the government's about to launch, it will be very much focused on towns, not cities. I think is an interesting diversion, because for a number of years there's been a very strong commitment to the importance of our major cities in driving growth. Having said that, most of our major cities are actually made up of a load of towns. So there is a slight dichotomy in that. But I do think it's very important that as the North as a whole, we identify those things that we need to do on a collaborative basis, and infrastructure, Northern Powerhouse Rail, call it what you will, is an absolute prime illustration of that. And then focus on what we need to do collaboratively across the North, and focus our attention, whether it's the Northern Powerhouse Partnership or Transport for the North, or whatever succeeds Transport for the North, if indeed it is going to transform into something else. We need to make it very important that those organisations and those capacities are focused on those key strategic infrastructure links. And I think that there is a need then for a bit of parochialism within our cities and towns to try and make certain that we are driving that revitalisation that's absolutely fundamental to local people. Because most of our particularly our younger and more deprived communities operate within a very, very limited geography. And therefore there is a need for us to try and make certain that there is opportunity being created in localities, and that we're working very closely with localities as well as across the North on those pan-regional priorities.
You mentioned the Levelling Up Fund, Eamonn. Here's my concern about that. I am, again, old enough to remember what I used to describe as beauty contests. Carrots would be dangled from government, and local authorities and stakeholders would have to shake their ass to meet the criteria of what that fund was saying you could apply for. And that, again, doesn't sit comfortably with me. If we're talking about genuine devolution, then actually that's about you having the fiscal tools to be able to deliver the priorities that are right for Greater Manchester. This idea that there's a fund that we have to bid into and compete for, as I say, I think that's a backward step. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Well, you'd be astonished to hear that I completely agree with you. We've been arguing that we need to have an integrated approach to places that then drives a longer term strategic approach to how we invest in the necessary measures that those places require. If you then turn that around and say there's a series of pots of money of 20 million quid, and here are the criteria and rules that you have to follow and in order to bid for them, and everything is done on a competitive basis, apart from the fact that it's very difficult to then turn that into an effective strategic approach, it's also very wasteful of resources. It's not an efficient way of managing, particularly when you consider that many local authorities have had such financial pressure on them for the last 10, 12 years, that the areas where they've had to strip out capability include those very areas, such as those strategic and policy areas, which you would have fallen back on being your bidding engines, as it were. But it was never the right way to go about things. And I would agree, a longer term strategic approach is absolutely necessary to delivering what we would regard as a meaningful levelling up agenda. And I'm not giving up on that. I think there is still room for us to make that argument and to build that momentum with government. But quite clearly, some aspects of the government strategy around short-term funding is very much of that. It is short-term, and that's just something we're going to have to try and adapt to, and apply as best we can to deliver our priorities. But as you say, it's not the ideal way of doing business.
Eamonn, you mentioned briefly the aviation sector, and we're all aware in this part of the world how important the airport has been to the growth of Greater Manchester. Some fantastic plans around the development and regeneration in and around the airport. Again, I've not been following this in any detail, but it doesn't appear to me that it's been an industry that has been particularly well supported through the last 9 months or so. What are the conversations around that? Because, as I say, it's a pivotal catalyst for economic growth, certainly has been over the last 20 years or so in Greater Manchester.
Well, it has, and I mean, they say that there's a very powerful vision around the airport. There's also an awful lot of delivery happening around the airport. I mean, the new terminal will be open in the summer this year. That's £1 billion worth of investment by the airport in its own future. So there's still a huge commitment there. I mean, you're right. The government has seen fit to not promote a comprehensive support package for aviation. That's well known. It's not a controversial statement. It's just a statement of fact. There is, I think, some strong optimism amongst the aviation sector, both in terms of airports and operators, that there could be quite a rapid bounce back. Since the Prime Minister's announcement the other day, apparently holiday bookings have gone through the roof as people gain confidence from the roadmap. But the reality is that there's an awful long way to go to recover for the aviation sector and for the airport in particular. And we feel the pain as local authorities, as major shareholders in the airport, because it's been a generator of very significant resource to support wider regeneration across GM, and that's disappeared as a result of the impact on the airport. And that will take time to come back. So I think we're optimistic about the future, but it's going to be a long, hard slog. And I do think that the government cannot maintain its current position of agnosticism, as it were, around the aviation sector. There will be a need for an intervention package support the recovery and sustainability of our key national and globally significant infrastructure, of which, in the context of the North, Manchester Airport is clearly absolutely paramount. So we will continue to work with them on that recovery strategy. I'll say it's going to be a long, hard slog, but I think there are some grounds for optimism that there will be back. But will aviation ever be as it was before in terms of numbers? I think the jury's still out around that. At any rate, it's going to take a time to recover.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other area that's often forgotten in terms of its importance to the economic performance of a place such as Greater Manchester, I think, is sport. And again, you and I would immediately think of the Premier League and Manchester United and Manchester City. But in your job, you will be very well aware that there are many clubs who are not at that level. And not just football clubs. We're looking at rugby league, we're looking at many other sporting institutions that have suffered greatly during the pandemic. And again, I would suggest not necessarily being a priority for support, but are hugely important to the communities where they operate as well. You mentioned your time at Stockport, for example. And again, Eamonn, I just wonder, because I'm not close to those guys, what are the sort of conversations, discussions that are taking place at that level with those sort of organisations and businesses?
Well, the bulk of the conversations that are happening around that agenda are very largely around local and community-based sporting organisations, which are fundamental to the health and well-being of local populations. And we've tried to maintain our level of commitment and investment into culture and sport across GM. And so interestingly, as we were looking at the very, very tough decisions that we needed to make in order to ensure that we were supporting the local authorities in GM to maintain a balanced budget position, one area which leaders agreed unanimously to protect was a relatively small amount of money, but £600,000 that we're putting into cricketing infrastructure to create cricketing facilities, particularly in those communities of deprivation where there's strong enthusiasm for the game and where we really want to encourage grassroots participation coming forward. And that's done in partnership with the ECB. And so there's been a real recognition of the importance of those institutions. There is no simple solution to building back. And we've seen the contortions that the Football League and the Premier League got into over how they might support each other financially some months ago. And I think that's going to be a long and hard road back for a number of those clubs. And, will some of them survive as professional institutions or not? I honestly don't know. But we are determined to continue to work through local authorities and through local partnerships and across GM Sport to support that wider range of activity, because fundamentally they are important economic drivers, but they're also absolutely fundamental to health and well-being, mental health, physical well-being of our local communities. Speaking as a United fan, not enjoying being 10 points behind City, but at least it's getting better.
Yeah, it's been an improved season, that's for sure. Listen, as an Evertonian who's just seen his team win for the first time this century at Anfield, I can see that there have been some positives with crowds not being able to get into the stadium. But
Mayor Burnham would agree with you on that particular game.
I'm sure Andy was cracking over open a vintage bottle or two as well at the weekend. So listening, I'm just. We could talk about all of the problems and the challenges that we faced and are about to face. But, the great thing about GM is that it's an optimistic place. It's a place where ambition and aspiration are at the forefront of its success. And it has been a fabulously successful place to be over the last quarter of a century now, probably longer. We've just seen the growth and the place become, in my opinion, certainly the capital of that northern powerhouse that we spoke about. So let's talk about those positives and tell me what you think the real key ingredients of our future success are going to be. Where would you like to see, where do you think that success lies?
Well, I've already touched on some of those areas where we think our economic success can be built. And that's around those areas where, we believe we are genuinely either world-class or capable of becoming world-class. And that takes us back to one of the things which I think has stood us in very good stead in terms of our outlook and our optimism. And that's been the desire to make certain that we have got a strong evidential base for what we're doing. I grew up writing strategies that would just tell you that Manchester was the greatest place to do anything in the world because it was just great, and that was fine. When we did the Independent Economic Review in 2008 and then repeated it again last year, it was very much focused on, please tell us independently, warts and all, what are the weaknesses as well as the strengths in the GM economy. And it's that willingness to take an evidence-based approach, that willingness to be challenged about what we're doing, that I think is one of the fundamentals that stood us in very, very good stead as we've moved forward over the last 10, 15 years. And that's been, I think, quite distinctive. The only other place that I know of that's done the same thing is London, and I think that's quite salutary, if you like. The other thing that our optimism is always based on, and it's something that people who come into the city comment on a regular basis, and that is, it's very, very clear that from day one, collaboration across the piece is just the DNA of the place. And we have the advantage of being big enough to be important, but also being small enough to be legible. And so it's easy to find the people that you need to talk to in order to make a difference. And I think that's been very, very important to us moving forward. But we need, on the basis of that challenge and that evidence base that we've generated, to then really, really focus our efforts on those sectors that are going to drive growth furthest and fastest and as I said before, make certain that we are really committed to the vision of an inclusive growth strategy. And that's easy to say, it's more difficult to deliver. But the real ambition for us now to take the city to its next level is to make certain that the growth that we've seen, which is undeniable and visible to all, is more accessible to all people. And I think I said it to you before, Frank. If I retire and I can say that there are fewer young people in Collyhurst looking at the city centre and saying that's got nothing to do with me, that would be a significant measure of success, to be honest. Because that's the gulf that we've got to bridge, and that's the gulf that every city's got to bridge. If you're living in Tower Hamlets and you're looking at Canary Wharf, there's more than water that divides you. It's bridging those gaps that's the really, really important part, and that's fundamental to the vision that's set out in the Greater Manchester Strategy.
Interesting that you mentioned London there. Just sort of triggers something in my head about the talk that we've had for years now about north-south divide. But again, you and I are conscious of the huge negative impact the pandemic's had on the capital. And as much as we will always be advocates for the north, we also recognise that London has been a big part of the success of UK PLC. And so again, I suppose a broad question this, but how important will it be for the capital to bounce back for the UK economy? Or do you think we're perhaps moving to a situation where we will have, through necessity almost, a different approach to how we get that economic growth and that economic bounce that we want to see?
I mean, London will bounce back. If I'm at the risk of being slightly politically controversial, its biggest challenge is not COVID, its biggest challenge is Brexit. But London will bounce back, and it needs to, as you rightly say, for the rest of UK PLC. And you're right to say that the success of the UK has been largely built on the success of London. The problem that we've got is that we are over-dependent on the success of London. But I did a session recently, a panel conversation with a number of people, including the leader of Barking and Dagenham. And you'd be surprised to hear that he said, if you're talking about levelling up, you've got to think about levelling up within London as well as between the north and the south. And I made the point that levelling up cannot be a north-south divide argument. It's got to be about creating opportunities for all of our people and exploiting the asset those people then represent, wherever they are. So I think we need to reduce our overall level of dependence on London, but that's not by stopping London growing, it's by accelerating and investing in growth in other parts of the country. And it's not just London, it's parts outside the Golden Triangle. And that's an argument that we've been putting forward for a number of years. It's been broadly rhetorically accepted. We now need to turn that rhetoric into reality. But it's not about constraining London. If we constrain London, then we constrain our biggest global asset. So it really is about creating conditions that can unlock the capacity of the remainder of the country better, nowhere more than here in the north.
Eamonn, for a long period of your tenure as Chief Executive of the Combined Authority, you used to come along to our events and we'd sort of dread mentioning the B word, wouldn't we, Brexit? And we said we were sick of talking about it. We'd be delighted when we could stop. And of course, COVID's come along and it's almost been seen as a side issue. But nonetheless, again, it's been central to many businesses. London, as you say, its financial services sector, which it's so reliant upon, has been hit. And there are companies in this part of the world who are now contending with much more bureaucracy, red tape, and trying to navigate through the new rules and measures that have been introduced. Again, I'm told by some senior Conservatives that this is just going to be teething problems, that we are going to get through this and it's going to be a lot easier, a lot smoother moving forward. What's your take on that?
I hope they're right. I honestly hope they're right. I mean, there's no point in railing about it. It's done. We are where we are, and we need, therefore, to work together, both public and private sector to try and make it as simple as possible for us to trade and compete in the environment that we now live in. That's just the reality of it. So I sincerely hope that what's being said about teething problems it is right. Do I worry that it might not be right? Yes, I do, to be perfectly frank with you. But there's no point in us railing against it. We are where we are, and we need to therefore work collaboratively in order to try and identify ways in which we can mitigate some of those issues and challenges that are now being faced by businesses, and understand how we therefore need to help sectors to adapt, help businesses to adapt, and support them through that process. So it is what it is, and we're already seeing that there are some short-term negative impacts of it on the financial services sector, particularly in London. But we just have to live with it and find a way through. So I do hope they're right.
And Eamonn, on a practical level, businesses who perhaps have been struggling with the new Brexit regulations, but more broadly, businesses who perhaps have not had the financial support that they need, or have just seen the latest route map and are thinking that's just going to be a bit too much of a stretch for us. Any sort of help, support structure within the Greater Manchester family where they can go and be signposted to? Yeah,
well, I'd certainly would urge them businesses to think of doing two things. One, if they are based in a specific locality, they should be talking to their local authority about the ways in which they might be able to access financial support. There is still some degree of discretionary financial support available within local councils. It's been administered through councils rather than through the CA. So it is important that you talk to your local authority. Not saying they will be able to help, but they may be able to help. The other route that I'd suggest that people think about is talking to the growth company, the growth hub in the CA, who can provide advice and support on the Brexit transition. They can provide advice and support on access to potential support in other routes. So Mark Hughes, who heads up the growth company in the CA, would be very happy to pick up the phone and talk to any businesses who wanted to access advice through the growth company and the growth hub.
And Eamonn, final one from me. We very briefly got the ball out earlier, but you're looking ahead to perhaps organising a nice successful parade of the treble, maybe even the quadruple for your friends over at the Etihad there. You thinking that could be on this season for them?
I'll leave that to Sir Richard. I'm sure he'd be more enthusiastic about that than I would. But no, I mean, let's be honest. At the risk of upsetting some of your compatriots, even me as a United fan, I'd sooner see City win it than Liverpool. To be honest.
Yeah, I think that's the difference. When people say to me, what are the differences between Manchester and Liverpool? One of them certainly that, as an Evertonian, my second favourite team is whoever's playing Liverpool on any particular weekend. So it is definitely a difference. But they played, on a serious note, Manchester City have just been playing out of this world football, haven't they, at times this season?
Well, whenever anyone says the absence of a single player undermines the performance of an entire team, well, they were without Kevin De Bruyne. Did they get better? Well, they bloody well did, irritatingly enough. But yeah, I think they look fairly unstoppable now.
Yeah. There's one question that's been put into the chat, actually, which is a really good one. It's surprised that we haven't touched upon it, but Maria Marn's asking about climate change, the green agenda. Again, I know that there's lots of plans around that for GM. So just talk us through some of those, Eamonn, please.
Yeah. Well, as you're probably aware, the mayor has given me a rare and precious gift of saying, never mind the government's target of 2050 for carbon neutrality, we're going to do it by 2038. That was based on the science from people like the Tyndall Centre at Manchester University said if we don't do it by then the impacts that we're all fearing are much more likely. And some places will need to go faster because not everywhere will be able to move at the same speed. So we are developing a number of approaches. In fact, we've got a seminar this afternoon for senior public sector officials talking about the low carbon agenda. But we're working on a number of fronts. One on transport, working towards promotion of much cleaner fleet through the electrification of bus, through the promotion via the clean air strategy of more efficient and lower carbon vehicles. We are working as well on the creation of community heat generation, which is a step toward, not getting all the way there, but a step toward more sustainable more heat. We're working to develop a major strategy for retrofit of the existing built stock, because whatever we do by requiring all new building to be zero carbon from a point in the near future, the vast majority of the built stock that we're going to have in 20 years' time is here already. And so retrofit both to commercial and public buildings and to domestic premises is going to be enormous. We've already initiated a number of pilots using things like ground source heat pumps to replace gas facilities in domestic dwellings, and that's something that we're going to seek to roll out much further. So there's a lot going on. Is it yet in sum total adequate to meet the 2038 target? No, it's not. We therefore need to continue to work to expand that. But I think it's interesting that the government's now declared it effectively has three priorities. One is about a competitive Britain in the global environment. The second is about levelling up. And the third is about decarbonisation and the achievement of net zero. And so I think if that focus can be maintained and promoted and then channeled through investment in local activity that can deliver real change, as we are doing across a number of fronts, then we've got a better chance of getting to where we need to get to. But will achieving zero carbon make dealing with COVID look like a walk in the park? I suspect it might. Yeah. It is the biggest challenge still facing us by a long way.
Eamonn, it's been great to speak to you. Thanks, by the way, Marie, for that question. And, as ever, I think what you've laid out is, Greater Manchester's determination to come through this crisis stronger, ambitious, aspirational, as you say, building back better. We can't wait to see you at a live event. Pour you a big glass of something nice and alcoholic, no doubt. And listen, mate, let's get together as soon as we can in a live setting. But thanks very much for your time today. It's always been a pleasure to speak to you. And as I say, I think you've spelt out very clearly that there's no lack of ambition and aspiration as far as the combined authority is concerned for the economic future of this place.
Okay, well, thanks, Frank, and thanks to all your members and supporters. See you soon.
Cheers, Eamonn. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.